Today, we're diving into a really significant book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. It's by Noam Chomsky Vijay Prashad.
And it's not just about troops leaving, it digs much deeper.
Exactly. It's a critique of U.S. foreign policy, arguing there's this underlying fragility and that past actions have these long shadows. Chomsky and Prashad definitely offer a perspective that challenges the usual stories we hear.
And that's what we want to do. Go beyond the headlines, look at the history, the why behind the policies.
Yeah.
Authors show this pattern in how the U.S. engages globally, from what they call ugly wars to something they term the Godfather attitude.
Okay, we'll definitely get to that.
So our mission here is to unpack the book's core arguments, pull out the key details, maybe some surprising facts.
Okay, let's jump right in then. That phrase you mentioned, the Godfather attitude,
Yeah.
pretty evocative. What exactly do Chomsky and Prashad mean by that? Is it just a metaphor or something more specific?
It's more than just a metaphor, though it's certainly a powerful one. They use it to describe a specific way the U.S. wields power globally, and they argue it's deeply rooted in its history as a settler colonial nation.
Okay.
It's this idea of viewing the world, or at least large parts of it, as its turf, its domain. The book gives some really stark historical examples.
Like what?
Things like the genocide against indigenous peoples, seizing territory from Mexico, France, Russia,
Yeah.
then later expanding into places like Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. There's this chilling quote from a General Jacob Smith in the Philippines back in 1898, ordering his troops to kill everyone over the age of 10. It really underscores that mindset.
Wow.
And echoes later, like the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, basically claiming the whole American hemisphere. Or much later, Lyndon Johnson talking about paving Vietnam and putting parking stripes on it. It's that same kind of controlling impulse.
It's a long historical thread they're tracing.
Exactly. And they argue this attitude just expanded geometrically after the Soviet Union collapsed. The U.S. became the sole superpower, feeling like it didn't have to answer to anyone anymore.
So the book presents this not as just random aggression, but as a kind of strategy to protect what they call property, privileges, and power. It sounds the most coldly logical in their telling.
That's a really key point they make. It's about protecting the advantages of the ruling elite against basically two main economic threats.
Okay, what are those?
First, it's stopping workers or peasants in countries rich in resources from demanding better wages or conditions. Keep the costs down for global supply chains.
Right, keep things cheap.
Pretty much. And second, it's about stopping other countries from making technological advances that might challenge the monopolies held by big U.S., European, or Japanese multinational companies.
So competition is seen as a threat.
A direct threat. And to counter these, the U.S. uses, violence or sanctions, or its influence over international bodies like the IMF or World Bank. The authors don't mince words. They call this system imperialism.
That's a very direct framing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this Godfather attitude as the foundation. How does the book show this playing out in those ugly wars like Afghanistan? The Withdrawal in 2021 really highlighted the failures, but the book goes back further, right, to the invasion itself.
It does, and it paints a really grim picture. The Withdrawal in August 2021, after 20 years, left very little positive behind, according to the authors. The death toll is huge, hundreds of thousands, and they cite a UN finding that 40% of civilians killed in airstrikes were children.
40%. That's staggering.
It is. And then, when the Taliban took over, the national bank was empty. The U.S. had seized $9.5 billion of Afghanistan's own reserves.
Seized it. For what?
To potentially pay compensation to families of 9/11 victims. But the immediate effect was pushing the country towards mass starvation. They estimate 97% of Afghans were below the poverty line by the end of 2022.
97%. Unbelievable.
And just days before the final withdrawal, that last U.S. drone strike killed 10 civilians, 7 children, and a charity worker named Zamari Ahmadi. It's presented as a final tragic example of the human cost.
And the book makes this claim, I found this really striking, that the U.S. actually turned down Taliban surrender offers right after 9/11. Is that right?
Yes, that's a critical point they emphasize. It really challenges the standard narrative. The authors state the Taliban, facing attack, offered multiple times to hand over Osama bin Laden to a third country. Even after the invasion started, they apparently offered a full surrender.
But the U.S. said no.
The response, famously from Rumsfeld and Bush, was basically, "We do not negotiate surrenders." Flat out.
Wow.
And adding to that, General Wesley Clark said later, in 2007, that the U.S. already had plans back then to go after 7 countries, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and others. So the focus wasn't just bin Laden.
So Bush saying later, we don't really care about bin Laden, fits that picture.
It does, and they quote Abdul Haq, who is an anti-Taliban Afghan leader, saying he believed the U.S. invaded mainly to show its muscle, to intimidate, not really to help Afghanistan.
Which undermines the whole humanitarian intervention argument.
Exactly, like Laura Bush talking about women's rights. The authors contrast that with the experiences of groups actually on the ground, like RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, or reports from UN envoys. They argue these justifications were largely window dressing. And this leads to the concept of blowback, unintended consequences of deliberate actions, which they argue is exactly what happened with groups like Al-Qaeda in the first place.
So what about the cost? $2 trillion spent in Afghanistan. The book must address where that money went and how effective the occupation actually was, right?
Right, absolutely. $2 trillion is the figure, but they detail how much of that was just lost, siphoned off by corrupt contractors. Cigar, the U.S. watchdog for Afghanistan reconstruction, called it a gallery of greed.
Gallery of greed.
Yeah, and they spent $88 billion trying to train the Afghan army, 300,000 soldiers on paper, but it was full of ghost soldiers, fake names on the payroll, and morale just plummeted, which is why Kabul fell almost without a fight in the end.
It paints a picture of incredible waste and futility.
Which brings us back, the authors suggest, to that question President Bush supposedly asked after 9/11, why do they hate us?
And what answer does the book provide?
They cite a Pentagon investigation that apparently told Bush quite starkly, they hate us because of what we have done to them. And they also point to a 2013 Gallup poll where people worldwide rank the U.S. as the greatest threat to world peace.
That's quite an indictment. Now, this pattern you mentioned, the shifting reasons, the overlooked peace options, the book argues this was even more pronounced in Iraq, describing it as a horrendous crime and an illegal war.
Yeah.
How do they break down the Iraq invasion?
They definitely use strong language for Iraq. They point to evidence, like Rumsfeld's notes right after 9/11, showing an immediate push to target Saddam Hussein, go massive, sweep it all up, things related and not.
Even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11.
Right, and they link this to the neoconservative group PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. Their report in 2000 had already called for ensuring unquestioned U.S. military preeminence.
So the groundwork was already laid.
That's the argument. And, crucially, they claim Saddam actually made repeated offers to withdraw from Kuwait back in 1990-91, but the U.S. rejected them because, as the book puts it, the U.S. desperately wanted the war.
Wait, hang on. So even before the 2003 invasion, the book says Saddam was trying to make deals, let inspectors in, and the U.S. still went ahead.
That's exactly what they argue. He kept allowing more UN inspections, which, as we know, found no WMDs. But the narrative had already been set. The book details how stories, like the infamous one about babies being thrown from incubators, were used to build public support in the U.S.
Fabricated pretexts.
Essentially, yes. And once the WMD justification collapsed because none were found, the mission shifted, didn't it? Suddenly it was about bringing democracy or the freedom agenda.
A moving target.
And Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General at the time, stated very clearly in 2004 that the war was illegal. The results: hundreds of thousands dead, infrastructure destroyed. And the book makes this really powerful claim that the U.S. deliberately stoked ethnic conflict between Shia and Sunni communities.
Whoa, deliberately. They argue it didn't exist in that way before.
They argue it did not exist before in the way it erupted after the invasion. They point to policies like de-Baathification, dismantling the state, which marginalized Sunnis and created a power vacuum and deep resentments.
And the strategic goal of doing that, according to the book.
Divide and conquer, essentially. Prevent a unified Iraqi resistance to U.S. interests. And those interests became clearer, they say, with the 2007 Status of Forces Agreement, the SOFA.
What did that reveal?
It demanded permanent U.S. military bases in Iraq and special treatment for U.S. oil companies to exploit Iraqi resources. So the authors conclude it really came down to oil and strategic positioning.
Which links back to that idea of protecting property, privileges, and power. This brings up the concept of just war theory. How does the book say that was used, especially after the Cold War ended?
The authors argue that ideas like just war and humanitarian intervention became much more prominent then. They replaced the old, the Russians are coming, justification for military action.
A new rationale.
Exactly. They critique thinkers like Michael Walzer and the whole responsibility to protect or R2P doctrine. They point out how it was interpreted to allow NATO to intervene sometimes without specific UN Security Council approval.
Giving NATO, and effectively the U.S., a freer hand.
Yes. allowing them to frame their actions as humanitarian, even when the results were disastrous, like in Yugoslavia, where the book claims NATO intervention actually escalated atrocities. It raises this uncomfortable question. Is there an implicit assumption that NATO, meaning the U.S., just can't commit war crimes?
That's a challenging question. Okay, let's pivot to Libya. NATO's bombing there really threw the Arab Spring into chaos. What does the book say about NATO's real mission and how it played out in Libya?
The book offers a pretty blunt take on NATO's role. It quotes the NATO Secretary General at the time, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, saying in 2014 that NATO's mission is basically to control the world and protect the global energy system.
Control the world.
It's quite a statement. And this fits, they argue, with NATO expanding eastward after the USSR collapsed, despite what they call a gentleman's agreement with Gorbachev not to move 1 inch to the east. A broken promise that resonates today, obviously.
And in Libya specifically.
The 2011 intervention, started by France, was initially under a UN resolution for a no-fly zone, Resolution 1973. But the book says NATO quickly violated that mandate, becoming the air force of the opposition, hitting government targets.
So taking sides actively.
Right. And crucially, there was an African Union peace plan on the table. Gaddafi had apparently accepted it. But NATO, the book says, simply dismissed it. They even stopped the AU delegation from traveling to negotiate.
So diplomacy was actively blocked. And then there was Hillary Clinton's comment after Gaddafi was killed.
Yeah, the book calls it a tasteless comment worthy of imperial overlords. Captures the mood, perhaps. But the outcome for Libya, utter catastrophe. Shattered country, warring militias, a flood of weapons across North and West Africa, fueling groups like ISIS.
And the migrant crisis.
A massive migrant crisis, yes. Which then led the EU to fund what the authors describe as hideous concentration camps in Libya and support gangster operations by the Libyan Coast Guard to stop migrants reaching Europe. It's a grim chain of consequences.
So given all this, what about Europe? Why does it often seem to just follow the U.S. line, even when it might hurt its own economic interests, like with energy supplies?
That's a fascinating part of the analysis. The book argues Europe has consistently chosen to be a subordinate to the United States, even though it has the economic and political weight to be independent.
Why? What's the mechanism?
They trace it back partly to the Marshall Plan after World War II. They argue it deliberately shifted Europe towards relying on oil, an energy source largely controlled by U.S. companies and interests.
Ah, creating dependence.
Exactly. Giving the U.S. effective veto power over Europe's energy security. And you still see that dynamic, they argue, in things like the strong U.S. opposition to projects like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia. It suggests Europe's alignment is often structural, maybe deeper than just policy choices.
Okay, so despite these interventions, the costs, the blowback, U.S. power is still obviously huge. But the book's title mentions fragility. What fragility are they talking about? And what changes do they see happening globally?
They're careful to say it's not the demise of U.S. power, but signs of relative weakness are showing. The withdrawals from Afghanistan and Iraq are part of that. Also, seeing U.S.-backed coups reversed in places like Chile, Honduras, Bolivia in recent years.
So cracks in the edifice.
But they also see the U.S. reacting to this shift. They identify the pressure campaign against China and Russia as the most dangerous escalation, an attempt to shore up that unipolar dominance.
We hear so much about the China threat. What's the book's take on that? It sounds like they might see it differently.
They definitely do. It's quite controversial. They argue the China threat is, in large part, simply China's existence, meaning its existence as a major power that cannot be intimidated and does not follow U.S. orders.
So the threat is independence, essentially.
Independence and its sheer economic and technological progress. Things like telecommunications, robotics. China's advances challenge the old assumption that only the West can lead development. China is just returning to its historical position. Its economy was huge compared to Britain's back in 1820.
And things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. The BRI, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, these are seen as building new frameworks, a kind of Eurasian network integrating Asia, Africa, maybe even parts of Europe, offering alternatives to the Western-led IMF World Bank model.
So it's a contest of systems.
Pretty much. The book frames it as two competing conceptions of the world order. You have the U.S.-backed rules-based order, which the authors say basically means follow U.S. rules.
Right.
And then you have the UN-based international order grounded in the UN Charter.
And underpinning the U.S. approach is still massive military spending, right? The book must address that disparity.
Oh, definitely. The numbers are stark. U.S. military spending was $778 billion in 2020, compared to China's $252 billion. Chomsky calls the U.S. system military Keynesianism.
What does that mean?
It's the idea that the state pumps money into the economy, but primarily through military spending, because that avoids unwelcome redistributive effects.
Meaning it doesn't help average people as much as social spending would?
Right. It avoids challenging existing power structures or the threat of democracy that might come with more social investment. And the consequence is this huge military machine, the constant risk of conflict, things like dangerous land-based missiles that create a use them or lose them pressure.
And the war in Ukraine, how does that fit into their analysis?
They see it as massively accelerating these trends, pushing the world faster towards multipolarity, strengthening the non-alignment of the global south, but also, tragically, setting back maybe permanently the meager hopes for escaping the total catastrophe of climate destruction.
Wow, that is a sweeping analysis, covering so much ground, from deep history to today's crises. The Withdrawal really hammers home that argument about the Godfather attitude and its consequences.
It really does. This deep dive, I hope, shows how the book urges you to look past the surface explanations, to see the structures and patterns Chomsky and Prashad identify. U.S. power is still immense, yes, but they argue it's facing real fragilities as it grapples with this changing multipolar world.
It certainly challenges conventional thinking. The authors seem to end on a note that change or radical correction is still possible. But it leaves you wondering, what would that really take? Given these deep historical patterns, these powerful interests, how do you actually shift towards cooperation instead of confrontation? How do you prioritize human life, the planet itself, above these power games? Is the will really there, the authors suggest? And if so, where does it come from? Lots to think about.